Okay. I was asked to give 2 speeches. Today's speech is going to be a low-resolution speech. Tomorrow's speech is going to be a high-resolution speech. So today's speech has pictures, and tomorrow's speech is deeper, and so there won't be any pictures. I'm the president of Working Villages International, and what is a president? A president is a leader, and what is a leader? A leader is someone who conscripts others towards a higher mission. So what was my mission? My mission was to get rural people out of poverty, and I did that precisely. There's a great quote that I like, which is that amateurs talk about strategy and experts talk about logistics, and today is going to be an amateur talk, because we're going to mostly talk about strategy. And so I had a strategy about how to get people out of poverty, and that was, especially in rural areas, and that was if I could get enough farmers in an area out of poverty and get them into the middle class, that they would act as an engine of economic growth for the rest of that community. And so I had to pick a number, and I thought what would be a good number for a community of farmers, and I came up with a number of 1,000. And so I set myself the mission when I was in college that I would get 1,000 farmers out of poverty. And I needed a place to do that, and I needed a strategy to do that. So I studied economics and I studied agriculture. And we've had a lot of discussion today about humility and listening and so on, and I came to understand that, but you will see that is not how I started my project. I started with a plan, and I needed a place to execute that plan. I had a problem in that I grew up very poor, and so I did not have any money. And so I came up with a plan and spent a few months trying to raise money, and the Lord was very merciful upon me and showered $15,000 my way. And I needed a place where $15,000 would translate into 1,000 farmers out of poverty. And those aren't as frequent as you might suspect. And so I settled on the eastern part of this country here, called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And that place was a wonderful place for me to go work in, because it was a war-torn area. And the people were very desperate and were willing to take a chance on the ideas of a penniless, underqualified college student. And so I had to buy a plane ticket, and with what was left, I walked across the border and looked for a place to start my project, and settled on this place through Zizi Valley. Someone else was talking earlier about visiting Burundi. And I think you were, and this is right across from Burundi. And so this side of the valley, though, is not as well off as Burundi. It was kind of the marching grounds. Anytime the Rwandese and Burundi's armies needed to go anywhere, that was the first place. It was nice and flat, and so they'd go right through there. And so the place got totally wrecked over years of war. And it was in a very bad shape when I got there. I spent a little bit of time looking in other places first, and I spent some time in Uganda and got a little worried about snakes. This place was attractive to me because there were no snakes there. And how are there no snakes there? Because there's snakes in Burundi and so on. And now there are snakes. But the reason there were no snakes there is the place was so poor that people had eaten all of the snakes in the valley. You know, a place is poor when it's going for that in order to get some food. So it was just the place for me. I knew one guy who I'd met in Uganda who helped me get across the border. And I did not speak any of the languages. And so this is very hubristic. And I got my first smack in the face right away, because my one contact took all my money and ran. So welcome to Congo. However, the place was desperate, as I mentioned, and there were some people who were willing to give me a chance. And so I assembled a team of about 20 people who believed at least enough in what I said to keep showing up and farm with me. And they were ridiculed every single day on their way to work. I was given a small piece of land outside of town by the local chief, who before I lost all my money, decided it would be a good idea to take a chance. So this group of 20 people regularly they were ridiculed every day and harassed by their neighbors, but they kept showing up to work. And we farmed together, and we set up some beautiful raised beds. And it just so happens I showed up at the right time and in order to plant because of the rainy season. So they don't have cold because it's on the equator, and so it's a rainy season and a dry season, and there's a season of the year where it's handy to plant, and I was there right at the right time. And we started to grow, and we grew all kinds of different seeds that I'd brought with me. I know it's probably ecologically not great to be bringing all the seeds from all over the place, but I comforted myself because I got them from Seed Savers Exchange. And so I said, these are heirloom seeds, they'll be okay. And so we grew all different types of crops, like cabbages and onions and different types of produce, as you'll see here. Eggplants grew really well there. Lots of, one of the problems that I had in Uganda was I wanted to eat salads because I felt like I needed that for my nutrition, but there were no salads anywhere, so I brought a bunch of different lettuce with me. Nobody else really ate this stuff, but we planted enough, and it was one of the only places in that whole area where you could get salads, but we grew wonderful melons there. As you can see, different melons, and these are actually heirloom melons that probably none of you have ever eaten, and a few people have, but I just went through the catalog before I left and picked originally about 60 different types of seeds, and then over time that grew to about 200 different varieties, and we just tried different things and saw what people ate, what people like to eat, and so on. But again, my plan was to get 1,000 farmers out of poverty, and I had about 20 people who were being harassed all the time. And so I realized that early on, the way to get people out of poverty was to grow crops that you could sell, and the produce market with no refrigeration and really bad roads and few markets and so on was not very strong. And so what me and my team eventually decided on was we wanted to grow rice. And we wanted to grow rice because rice in a lot of parts of the world is what the very poor will eat. In this part of Africa, that's not the case. Rice is a middle-class food. And so if you can grow rice, you have a pretty good market with it in the cities nearby. And while this place is a valley in the middle of nowhere, it does have some pretty big cities nearby, both in Burundi, the capital of Burundi, Bujumbura is right over the river, but also in Rwanda. And the biggest market for us was in Congo, in a place called Bukavu. And Bukavu had like 2 million people, over 2 million people are living in Bukavu. And so it had a middle class. This place has a lot of gold. Some of the largest deposits of gold left in the world are in this area, and so there are gold mines, and that generates a middle class and so on. And so we knew if we could grow rice, we could sell it. And so we needed to plant some rice, and through one of the people on my team, we managed to acquire this piece of land here, and I know we have some people from West Africa. This is elephant grass, and I was talking to a man from Nigeria, and he said you couldn't pay people in his area $100 a day, and you'd have to beg them to cut elephant grass. But we were very lucky. We had people who were willing to work hard, and so we cleared a big area of this elephant grass, and we tilled it up. And this was a project that I fundraised for, and so we were able to hire about 100 people now. So we started with 20, but because we were able to grow and the people who were supporting my organization back in the US, which we'll talk about, I guess, a little bit more tomorrow, and when we get into the more detailed picture, were willing to fund this project. And so we hired about 100 people, and we planted dryland rice. A lot of people familiar with rice are familiar with irrigation paddies, but that's only one type of rice. There's another type of rice called dryland rice, And you can grow either without irrigation. It's just that you can't really flood dryland rice very effectively, but you can wetland rice. So we grew it, and we got a harvest. And it was miserably hot, and that's the only place we could store it. That's why I looked so unhappy. Also probably because I wasn't fully engaged in holistic development, which is true. So we grew the rice, and it was a good crop. Each one of these is 100 kgs of probably, in all honesty, about 120 kgs topped off to the top of rice. But then a terrible thing happened. So rice, as I mentioned, is a middle-class food. We're in a poor area. There is no middle class. Nobody here is eating rice. Everybody else is eating either corn. And when I say corn, I don't mean delicious sweet corn on the cob. The thing you have to understand about this part of Africa, and most of Africa that I've been, it may be different in the West Africa. I've never been there. But in this area, the corn that we grow is what is known as dent corn, or when I was growing up and we grew it, it was called cattle corn. And so it's pretty tasteless stuff, but it does make a good flour. And so the food that a lot of people eat is called matoke and also ugali. Ugali is from corn, and matoke is a type of tasteless banana or a plantain. And another one is cassava. And unfortunately, at this particular time, a very nasty parasite came into the valley called the white fly. I don't even know what its actual name is, but it took out a huge swath, somewhere in the 90s of percentile of all the corn and cassava in our area. And so it really hit a lot of people who were just barely struggling to get by. And so we had a big problem. And now my organization's plan and my mission was to get rural people out of poverty. But we're the only organization around, and so people, the leaders from the community came to us and said, you have to do something to help. And I said, well, I don't have the money to feed all these kind of people. I can barely afford to pay 100 people. What are we going to do? And so they said, well, aid development, you can come, you can buy a bunch of food and give it to people, because they have to eat. And I said, well, first of all, I'm not made of money. Where am I going to get the money for that? And second of all, our donors want to give us money because we don't want to do that, because we want to develop people rather than just give them aid. And so we thought about it, and we talked about it, and we came up with an idea. And you have to make hard choices in development work, and you have to set your priorities, because the need is far greater than you can possibly ever do with your resources. And so what we decided was we could merge both visions. And so we went back to our donors, and I pitched this plan. And I said, give us the money, and we will hire 500 people, and we will use the money that you give us to feed them. They'll work, and their wages will be deferred. And their wages will be deferred until we harvest and we sell. And they will agree to defer their wages if we feed them in between then. And so we hired 500 people. And what were these 500 people going to do? They weren't going to grow dryland rice, because, if the rain doesn't come at the right time, you might get wiped out, and you owe a lot of people some money, and then you've just caused a big problem for nothing. So we wanted to do irrigation. And so we dug some very serious irrigation canals with these 500 people. And we were able to grow wetland rice. And we set up paddies, and we worked very hard. And at the end, we were able to grow a bigger harvest, and that we were able to pay people with. Then we said, look, to be all in on one crop is dangerous, because what happens if that crop fails? We just had the white fly come in. They took out all the corn. If we'd been growing corn, we'd be in a world of trouble, because we'd owe a lot of people money. But the system worked, and we were able to have people stay on for the next season, because now we had irrigation. And it's also not good to just grow rice after rice after rice. So I thought, okay, we need some legumes to be interspersing in with this rice, and so I wanted to diversify into beans. But we're also just growing beans and rice, right? And that's a perfect protein, but that's no good to the local economy, because yes, they eat beans, but they don't eat rice, and so they eat corn. And so I figured we need to grow corn as well, and so we grew a lot of corn because there was a good market for it. And when people talk about helping farmers, it really is not discussed enough that the markets are absolutely everything. If you have markets, you can make farmers succeed. If you don't have markets, it doesn't matter what you grow. It's not, they're going to be either subsistence farmers or they're going to go out of business. And we wanted good, solid middle-class farmers that could help raise up the people around them. So we grew a lot of corn, and we became, over time, the largest grower of corn in the province. And this is one of many of these cribs, and these are joke cribs compared to what you see here in Pennsylvania, but it's the best we could do. And each one of these has 100 metric tons of corn inside of them, and there's other pictures of me with next to a big row of them, but I look much more heroic in this picture. So when I was selecting, I picked this one. But the problem was that while we were employing people and increasing people's incomes, that wasn't what I wanted. I wanted to get people out of poverty and get them into like a strong middle-class position. And when you're employing a lot of people, it's a big headache. You have hundreds of people that you have to manage. Sometimes there's some disruptions. People have to be fired. That creates social animosity and various different problems. And it's not where I want it to be, because that's not a people who are free. That's a bunch of people who are absolutely dependent on me. And the stress is incredible. Like, you have to make payroll, and if there's a shortfall in any production or anything like that, you have to make that up, which means you got to go out there and raise money. Somebody asked if I'd done talks like this before, and I mentioned to them at one point I was giving 2 to 3 talks a day because you got to raise money. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. And so one way that I got out of that trap, because the people don't like it either, because some people are much harder workers than other people. It's something that is rarely talked about. And how is it that you're paying the same amount of money for everybody? And I know there's a really great biblical passage about that, but it is a problem for people's psyche, and you have to deal with people's psyche. And so we came up with a solution that sounded like a way out of this mess. And what we did was we broke up the farm into plots. And we have a long, convoluted way about how we did this. Like, people drew lots from hats, and then they drew the lots again the next season, and so on. So we retained ownership of the farm, but we were going to use this as an incubator farm. And so for 2% of the production of a farmer, we would take a fee in kind, which means they'd pay in grain, of 2%, and we would help facilitate maintaining the irrigation systems. Irrigation like this, like you saw there, gets silted up. It has to be maintained regularly. And we'd maintain the irrigation system, and the farmers themselves would control or own, or however you want, for an individual, for a season, a piece of land that they could grow their own crops on. And they could sell either with us or they could sell on their own. It was fine. It was their crops. They could eat them if they wanted, whatever they wanted to do. This system was very popular, especially amongst the people who worked hard. And the average income, so some people made a lot more, some people made a little bit less, or a lot less, depending on if they weren't able to farm. This wasn't a perfect system by any means of a heavenly system. But the average incomes from what we had already raised went up by a factor of 4 just in that one season. And that started to give us the middle-class families that I was so much looking forward to. And these families then started to be able to do all kinds of interesting things with their money. They bought other land. They went out. So this was land that I guess they did not own title to. but they used the wealth they generated from this land to buy other land for dry land crops, either for vegetables or for corn in particular. And so it ended up being the case that more land was owned by our farmers outside of our land than actually on our land. We never counted that in our statistics, in our impact statistics, but it was just something to note. They also bought shops. They also bought, and started second businesses and so on. They bought animals and started raising animals for that market as well. Another thing that happened was kind of a shock to me. I originally was there thinking I was going to go and have to build houses for people because all the housing stock was destroyed. And so I actually started building houses, and we had some model houses, and they were really awesome and so on. But we had to drop the project because when people had the money, they started building their own houses. We didn't need to do that. They started getting together they were already organized in a group to figure out how the land is divided up and so on, and they elected their own representatives and then fired them when they found they were corrupt and elected new ones, and rinse and repeat. But they also thought, well, how can we pool some of our money together and do other projects? And so they built schools for their children because they were part of the community. Another thing that they did, which I was very much against doing, because everybody in my neighborhood in Maine, where I was from, was running an orphanage, and so I'm never going to run an orphanage. But the people there were like, well, we've got a lot of people getting killed from the war and who have already died from the war, and so we have a ton of orphans, and this is a problem, and we want to do something about it. And so without me, this has nothing to do with me. I would have discouraged the idea if anybody had come to me. So they, on their own, set up supporting orphans so that the orphans could go to school, and one of them was actually the valedictorian. I just think that's an interesting story. It's no credit on me or anything like that, but it's just an interesting story that the people there decided on their own that they wanted to do this thing. And this young lady here, if they had not done that, she would not have gone to school, and that area would not have had that valedictorian. I just think that's an interesting thing. So here we were. We had a very successful project, and around about this time, I started to get some notoriety in the community, and I had originally been, like I said, doing 2 to 3 talks a day whenever I was back in the States trying to raise money. And that's because I was, trying to raise, money from people who didn't have any. And so you got to do a lot of talks in those circumstances. And so, but we started to get larger donors. And the larger donors were very interested in impact and growth and all those things, which are wonderful things. Some really great people. And so we were encouraged to grow. And so, and they had all kinds of wonderful ideas of how we could do that. And so one of them was, well, what have we done that's super successful? Well, in farming, water is absolutely a game changer. If you go from one growing season, and this is on the equator, you go from one growing season to 2 growing seasons, or 3 growing seasons, or if you're a really good farmer, 4 growing seasons, that makes a big difference in your annual income. And so irrigation was the idea, and we said, well, look, we have enough farmers. We've got enough people who've figured out how to farm in this area, and so if we just build a massive irrigation system at this point, what would happen? Maybe people would just go farm it on their own. So we had this idea. We located this area that would be a good spot. It would irrigate a lot of land that didn't have any water and nothing was being grown on it. But once it has irrigation, it's a valuable piece of property. And so we went to the local community, talked to the leaders, and decided to expand and build essentially a dam. We called it a barrage, but it's a dam, and it diverts water to this irrigation canal system that we dug out, and able to provide water to a few thousand acres, a couple thousand acres actually in this place, about 2.2 or something thousand acres. And so we went there and we started to build this dam. Well, what you'll notice about this dam is it requires stone, a lot of stone. And what happened was that the people in charge of the stone, in charge of the quarries, or the place where the stone was gathered, started to say, well, actually, this stone, the price is much, much higher. And then every petty official, I understand working with government officials is wonderful. When you have a functioning country, it works even better. In a place like Congo, you want to know who's the government official in charge of X, I'll tell you who. It's whoever wants to get money out of you is the government official in charge of X. And so every government official comes and says, we need some money, otherwise you can't, move your trucks here or there. And so who are you? Well, I'm the guy telling you can't do it. So what are you going to do, run over me? So just this one level of extortion after another, and slow projects. And then this is, as I mentioned, a war zone. And so, okay, well, now something's happening there. This NGO's happening there. Who even knows the whole story? But various militias start fighting at the site of the work. So we start building this. If you'll notice, it looks very dry in the background. We start building this in the dry season when the water is little. This is the river that we're using. Is a river that comes out of the mountains. So there's some flow all year long, but the river is really strong in the rainy season. In the dry season, it's not very strong. And so our idea is we build this in the dry season, and we have plenty of time to do it. And we have a schedule from the donors as to when they'll provide funding for each different step. However, every different little bit of attempt of extortion delays the project a little bit while you try to sort that out, and then the fighting starts. And so we're pushing frantically to try to get this dam. So literally, almost on a daily basis towards the end, people were out there working, the fighting, the shooting would start, people would leave, the shooting would stop, people would come back and start working. And so it was just very slow. And then the donors start saying, well, maybe we'll delay the next tranche of funding until such and such. But when a funding is delayed at one end, it's not like there's a bank in Congo. You have to walk in with buckets of cash and start and pay people that way. And so that takes time because you're only allowed to move, $5,000 a day because of the anti-terrorist regulations in the United States. And so if you get a shift, $70,000, you don't do it in a day, you do it over a number of days, and then that's how long it takes. And if you don't pay workers, they don't work. So one delay after another, getting squeezed at both ends of the pipeline, I learned a very important lesson because the rainy season came and destroyed our dam. And the place just turned into a mess afterwards. As soon as the dam was destroyed, the donors bolted. And so when the donors bolted on their commitments, I had to go raise more money. And without any money, of course, I wasn't being paid. The secret of most of this, which we'll talk about tomorrow, is I wasn't paid for almost the entirety of this project. But I had to leave my apartment, and I moved into this wonderful new residence in the middle of the forest with no road to it, or running water, or electricity, or anything like that. And if you look very closely, you'll see a hand saw sawing a log on the stairs. Sawing up wet wood with a handsaw in the middle of winter is a bummer. And it doesn't burn as well as you might suspect. So I was in a hard space, and that was an very important lesson, a culmination of all the different things that had happened, got me into that space. But an interesting thing happened while I was in the States trying to scare up some more money for projects in Congo. This is what was going on at our farm, not the dam, but at our farm in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Nobody knew. Everybody just kept showing up to work. It was their own fields, and they kept farming. They had no idea that the organization that had done all this was completely broke, and the president was living, trying to, hack through a piece of wood with a handsaw to heat himself for another hour, So eventually, because this kept going and the project kept succeeding because it didn't require fresh injections of money, and it was a success. This looks like a beautiful thing. This was nothing like this around this for 100 miles. It was completely bombed out area. But this was a vibrant, thriving place, and we were actually able to raise some money, this time from some local wealthy people in Congo who said, hey, you know what, that doesn't look so bad. I wouldn't mind doing a project like that myself. And so we were able to raise some money and actually build a second farm the same size as this farm the year that I was living in a shack in the middle of the forest. And when I went back to Congo, after we had secured enough money to keep going with the other projects that we had in mind, I went back and I went for a hike. And I wanted to show this picture because I actually, that was the point where I turned around and saw at the top of this mountain this big piece of you can see, your eyes are drawn to the houses, but mine are drawn to the backyard there. This thing circled here because that's our first farm that we built. And this is the second farm that we built. And this is the two of them right next to each other. And I wish I was a better photographer or had a drone at that time that could have gotten a really good photo. But for me, what I saw in my eyes, which I didn't really capture as well on the camera, was those looked like lungs, because those were the two lungs that were supplying that community right there with all kinds of money. We had 1,600 families at this point who were earning 10 times the money that they had been earning before they started farming in this area. So it was a 10x increase in wealth in this community for 1,600 families, and that made a huge difference. And one story that might resonate with some of the people here who have been in a really poor place like Congo or probably many places in Africa or other places is everywhere I would go when I first went to Congo, people would be saying Mzungu, 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 which means white person. And that they would just be like saying Mzungu, and it was often Mzungu franga, which is like, Mzungu, give me money. Or Mzungu, like asking for things. There's so much need everywhere. And when I walked up to this mountaintop, and even though I was living in a cabin in the forest and so on, I'd raised money and I had more money than anybody else in that area, no one was begging. It was shocking to walk up there. Nobody confronted me and asked for anything because they didn't need it, because they were doing well economically. And so it wasn't something that crossed into their brain. It was just a change in consciousness, and it was just shocking to me. And so we looked at, okay, what was it that we did that was successful? And we knew irrigation was a big thing, but how you get irrigation was a big difference. And going in with our big name as an organization, talking with the leaders who were in the community, trying to get them all on board, trying to get everybody all on board, trying to get the different, this area has 7 different languages inside of there, and there are ethnic groups that correspond to each one of them, and while they all probably lived very peacefully before the wars started, wars have a momentum of their own that change people's minds deeply. And so communities that might have done well together in the 1980s were no longer well. Now they had their own militias and they fought each other, and the reasons for why they originally started fighting were completely lost to them. They had no idea. They were just fighting. And they had their different reasons were weekly reasons rather than long-term theological or long-term theoretical reasons. But the community organizations worked, the democratically run organizations worked, and people taking ownership of what they have worked. And so we decided to replicate that and build another dam on a different piece of land that was going to irrigate even more land. But this time we were going to do it differently. This time we did not come in as Working Villages International. There was almost no knowledge that a foreign nonprofit organization was involved in this at all. we did our intelligence work. We found out who were the people in this area who wanted this project to happen. And we worked through the people who were close to us at the first farm project. Our team worked closely with them, and I didn't work with them personally. And through them, worked as facilitators to these local groups that had been established to rebuild the dam system. And it all happened very quickly, and people all worked together because they didn't know that there was money involved. It was just, hey, we want to get this project done. We have all these other people who want to get this project done. Should we go do this? And what happened from these meetings, and there were a ton of them, was a different pile of stone, and a big one. And this stone cost nothing. The other stone cost money, and the money went up and up and up, and the price went up 12 times as a result. But this pile of stone was different. And what was interesting to me was you had two groups in this area, two ethnic groups in this area that had been fighting before this, and they agreed to stop fighting to build the dam because they could see further up the valley where our first two farms were that people were doing well, and they were doing well with irrigation. That was the only story that they needed. And here was an opportunity to get irrigation. And this is a really important thing for understanding peace, is young men are not designed to just sit and let things happen to them. They act. And they can either act for good or for ill, but they're going to act if they're in a bad situation. And so if you give people something constructive to do and you give them a story of how they can get out of the mess that they're in, the militias were paying people $10 a month to be in the militia. If you say, look, you can make $2,400 a year as opposed to $120 a year if you're a farmer, that's a big difference. So, and so they agreed to stop fighting, put down their guns, and see if they could build this dam together. And they were all worked together, and the people who were gonna use the fields cleared the fields themselves, and this is hard work. And this type of field clearing, traditionally, on our first farm, this type of work is not the type of work of women, but even because it's very, very hard labor, it's not that the men will refuse to have the women do it, the women will refuse to do it. But here, people had a field in the area that was going to be irrigated, and they went to the various meetings, and they cleared their own fields, men and women. We provided the technical support of how to do this, and we did it very, very discreetly. We hired engineers from Bukavu to come and work there, and they were just coming as people facilitating what was going on there. It was not like this organization, Working Village, just hired these people to come over here. It was just these people, they want to help, they're coming, and they're gonna do this. We did have some need for some heavy equipment, and we got that, and that's another story of how we kind of hid who owned that heavy equipment, because there was none of that in the valley at the time. But we provided the heavy equipment to dig the canal system, and we built the canal system and did the various repairs to the networks that were needed. And we had a wonderful irrigation system that actually worked, and there were no holdups, there was no extortion, there were no problems as a result of this. That was a big success. But the success didn't stop there, because what was interesting was that this community organization process, in my brain, I never thought that it would continue. Even though it did continue at our original farms, I had no idea that it would continue on the site, but it did continue on the site. And the other thing that community organization did that was a benefit over what we were thinking about when we were doing plannings on the first dam that failed is they knew the way the community worked. They thought of things you'd never think of. And I really love this picture because it's a picture of the community knew that this is the route that you travel if you want to get firewood. And you need firewood every day. And so people would go out in the mornings and get firewood and they'd come back, but we were going to build a big canal right across that. So what do? Well, you drop sticks across it and you walk across where the canal is going to be. But because the community wasn't involved, we didn't just make life difficult for people who were going to be crossing there. They didn't know that there was a budget for the dam or anything like that. They just said, hey, we should have some crossing areas here. And these are the places that the pastoral people like to herd their cattle. And if there are going to be these canals coming, they're going to walk down and they're going to want to drink out of the canal. And therefore, they're going to erode the banking. And so we should pave an area with stones so that the animals don't wreck that. So there's a lot of stuff that people thought of. And we want bridges here because this canal is going to go through this area. Another thing that was really interesting was after we left, these community organizations were still around, and they now had resources. They were generating serious money coming out of these irrigation facilities, and they organized themselves and they said, we're going to pay a little bit towards this group, and then we're going to figure out what we're going to do with the money. And I'm sure they had problems here and there, but they did come up with some incredible things. And this is one thing that I wanted to share, which is they all got together again and they got more stone. And they decided they wanted to build a processing facility for all the rice. So instead of selling rice that was just unprocessed, they still had the hull on it. They built these facilities so that you could take the hull off of the rice. And so they did this. They came and asked our engineers if we would help them, but this is all funded by them. And a lot of the labor came from them as well. And just a place where your average farmer and superhero, that's like, I don't know, it's like 80 kgs of rice that woman's holding right there, that grandmother's holding right there, if you think you're strong. And another amazing thing happened because of this. Because this facility was built, local traders from Bukavu, people who had shops, so instead of taking the rice to Bukavu and finding a market, the people, and then you need transport and so on, these women and a whole bunch of other people like them would come to this site to buy rice from the group that was there. And so I like this picture because I like the attitude in this picture. I know we talked about the holistic development and the attitude that people have. And these women have the attitude of people who are free and are not on their knees and are not worried. I've got a few minutes left, so I will tell you one little anecdote that I'll share with you is I went with another organization that was interested in working in the valley. They ended up not doing it, but they were doing interviews of people, and I was sitting in on the interviews. And I sat in on one interview with a woman, and she was a widow. She had 12 children, and they wanted to know how poor she was. They ended up not working in this area because the people weren't poor enough. And her story was shocking to me, because you think a widow with 12 children, this woman is destroyed economically. Single mom, 12 children. Because in Congo, you don't send your children to school for free. You have to pay to send them to school, if you have to pay school fees. And the interview was asked, like, how do you manage to pay the school fees? How do you manage to feed the children? And this is a woman, she wasn't a farmer of ours. She wasn't anybody who owned land or anything like that. But she was able to pay for all of her children's school fees, and she was able to feed them. And we met at her house, and it was a humble house, but it was a respectable house. And she was able to do all of that while not owning any land, just as a worker for other farmers, because these other farmers would hire people as well. And I thought, my goodness, this person can fund this type of expense layout just with wages. So that was a shocking anecdote to me. And that's a people who are not free. That's a people who are free, who are not on their knees, and who are organized. And they're organized democratically, and that has ripple effects. When I was in Congo, it was a dictatorship originally, and it was a one-party dictatorship. In 2018, as I mentioned, my plan was 1,000 people over 10 years. And in 2018, I transferred transferred everything that we had in Congo over to our Congolese team, and so it was completely Congolese owned and run from 2018 onward. And in 2019, because the people had such respect for the people involved in this project, by a margin of 4-1, the people of the whole province, not just this tiny valley in the province, but by the whole province, elected this man, my very good friend and right-hand man in Congo, and my brother in my heart, Fiston Malago, to be the vice governor of the entire province by a margin of 4-1. And that was just a extra demonstration because my right-hand man, Fiston, was not of the political party that had been the dictatorship. It was a new time, and these people were not on their knees, they were not afraid, and they were willing to take a chance on something that they thought would move their lives forward. So I'd like to end there and say thank you.